will ever get that recognition, specifically a statue?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, listen, James Brown has as much national and cultural significance as Elvis Presley. And people go to Graceland like they were going on a pilgrimage, like they were going to a holy shrine. And we ought to at least, even if it's just about the business of tourism, we ought to consider that James's Beach Island home has that kind of significance. That's where he left most of the his artifacts, a lot of the background of why he wrote a certain song, costumes. I mean, that's his base, and we ought to, as a state, embrace that for what it is culturally, but we ought to embrace it for what it can do for us as it relates to tourism and bringing positive recognition to the state. You know, James went through a whole lot of different changes when he was coming up, fighting record companies. Most people don't know that to get out of his first record contract with King Records, James made the claim that the record contract violated the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that it kept him in involuntary servitude. So James was a very smart businessman. And that's the other part that people forget. I mean, they look at that black capitalism period that he went to. But James was one of the first people that went to the federal government, to people like Richard Nixon, to argue that I should have an FCC license so I can start a radio station. So when you look at the black movement and spreading the word, James bought a radio station, then other people bought radio stations, they hired black people, they played black music. When I was coming up, you could only get black music after midnight in some cases, or you got it from Randy Radio out of Nashville, you know, when you on those little AM radios. So James kind of broke up that whole monopoly that these smaller country stations or these white owners had on the record business and on the radio business. So when you look at the history of what James did to talk about development of black business and this whole idea of the black capitalist movement, James was at the forefront of that movement. And
we certainly didn't know that, and we would never think about James Brown in that fashion. You mentioned his funeral, and you talk about what Michael Jackson did in this article. Tell us about that.
Michael loved James Brown, and as Michael said at the funeral, James Brown was his hero. And I was talking to some of the funeral home people. C.A. Reed Funeral Home, which buried James, well, the father was James's business partner back in the early 60s when James opened up the Third World nightclub over in Augusta. And I believe, now I'm not sure on this one, that James might have had a little bit to do with him setting up his funeral home. So, you know, when there's this controversy about, well, these people are burying James and they don't, from some of the estranged family members, well, you know, that James had that relationship with the funeral home director. But anyway, I was talking to the funeral home guy, and he said Michael came by the funeral home after they did up James's hair, and Michael was in the funeral home with the body for about an hour, and James, he didn't wear his hair like that. And he took his fingers, twisted James's hair, he wore it like this and flipping it around. And the funeral home guy says to me, man, we had just finished doing James' hair. We had to call the beautician back in after Michael left. And of course, Michael called back because he had to see James after one more time. But Michael really loved James. I mean, when you look at James Brown, when you think of James Brown, you think of Michael Jackson, you think of Prince, you think of some of the, I'm not as familiar with some of the newer artists that are out there today, but of course they owe a debt of gratitude to James.
Sure.
And Michael truly gave James his due. He hung out at that funeral and he participated in the Going Home program for James.
But there were lots and lots of stars at that funeral.
There were lots of stars, but not as many as you would expect, given the magnitude of James's impact on music. Part of that might have been due to the fact that it was Augusta, Georgia, and South Carolina. I mean, MC Hammer showed up, Bootsy Collins was there. Of course, Fred Wesley was there. You know, Fred Wesley lives in South Carolina now, over in Manning. You know, play it, Fred!
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so, and of course, Maceo was not there, which was surprising because Maceo was on tour with Prince. So, you know, I expected more artists to be there, but, you know, it's the momentum to really recognize James's achievements is still growing, and I suspect that it will grow more as the years go on.
But, you know, and maybe time will help.